Okay, how many of you, and I'm going to raise my hand because this is what I would have said when I was your age, how many of you just really don't want to be leaders at all? Maybe you took the class because it's called leadership, right? Okay. I'm totally impressed. So then I need to give you a couple confessions about me. Is it loud enough without it? Okay, so I think this is scary. If you can't hear me back there, let me know. Thanks, Alvin. So a couple of confessions about me. First of all, I actually never wanted to be a leader. All throughout my life, I always have preferred to be in the background. My idea was in work and in my schooling, it was just keep your head down, do your job, leave it to your bosses or people who are older or smarter or stronger than you. Let them do the leadership. Because even as a young person, I realized that leadership was stressful. It involved people asking you to lead. And that was a little bit scary. I figured older, wiser people. Now last week you had Mo come here and she gave you a great pep talk about leadership. She talked about how leadership is fun. And I love Mo. I think she is a fantastic leader, but fun? Personally, I don't actually think of leadership as being fun. I think of it as, it could be exciting, it could be rewarding, but people looking to me for wisdom or for guidance, it's really hard to do that and to do it well. And obviously now, as an associate vice president, I'm in a leadership position. And I don't want to say that I'm scared all the time, but I feel a burden because people are coming to me for leadership. So that's one thing. Put that aside. And then the other thing I need to tell you, which is also a confession, is that I don't have any idea what leadership is. I really don't. The other part of it is that the more I think about leadership, see, I used to think I understood it, and the more I think about it, in many ways, the less I understand it. So that probably instills confidence in you about this lecture. See, for the next 45 minutes, what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you some stories. And I think they all involve leadership, and they all happen to me. They're all true, at least true as far as I can remember. And they all take place in schools. In the introduction, you hopefully caught that for the last 56 years, I've been in schools. First as a student, then as a teacher, a graduate student, professor, and now as an administrator. And the idea of this is, I'm hoping that all of the themes and ideas that are embedded in these stories will show you that leadership can be found in very unexpected places and in unexpected situations. When we think of leadership, I think we often think of great and powerful people, both good and bad. People like Martin Luther King, George Washington, Adolf Hitler. Those were all leaders. But I hope these stories are going to demonstrate that leadership is everywhere. And if you see yourselves as leaders, you are way ahead of where I was when I was sitting in seats like yours. So here's my goal today. My goal is actually to get you to share a little bit in my confusion about leadership. Because I want to get you to think deeply about what leadership is. And I want you to come away with a little bit less certainty than you may have had when you started this lecture. And that's not a bad thing. Because a lot of educational theory says that you need to start with something that you think you understand. Then you're shown things that might actually call into question what you thought. That's a little bit of confusion, and that leads to a sense of greater understanding, deeper understanding. So that's what I'm going to do. So you had to read chapter 2 for this lecture, right? It's great for insomnia, huh? No, I'm just kidding. But it is a little bit confusing, isn't it? Because there's a lot of complicated language, but it does help you to understand that leadership isn't just one thing. It's not necessarily an agreed upon concept. There are many different theories of leadership, and the book does kind of what I'm going to do here, which is to start with more simple views of leadership and then get to the more complex. So for me, the most useful part of the chapter, actually, and you don't need to write it down, it's in the book, was the 6 truths of leadership that they listed. And I'm going to use that as a touchstone in this lecture. So in the chapter, I actually was hoping that they would provide us with a useful definition, a simple, useful definition of leadership that I could use as a starting point in the lecture. When you go back and reread it, you'll notice that they spend 4 pages explaining what leadership is, and at the end they kind of say, well, you know, what does it all mean anyway? What does it matter? but it does matter. So I'm going to provide you with a definition that I came up with. And it's pretty simple. Leadership's about getting others to think about stuff, or to believe stuff, or to do stuff that they wouldn't necessarily do without the leader's influence. Now, I use stuff intentionally because I want to be nebulous. Because when I was young, I thought it was simple. Stuff meant doing whatever the leader wanted. And who were the leaders that I was familiar with? Well, there were people who held authority over me. There were people like my parents, my teachers, my older brother, because he could beat me up. And that was reason enough to assume that they were the leaders. But over the years, I've come to see, obviously, that it's more complicated than that. So this definition about thinking, believing, or doing stuff, I wrote that definition down, and then I started thinking, well, that's actually a lot like this educational philosopher, James Banks, who says, this is what he says you want teachers to do. You want teachers to help their students know, care, and act. Think, believe, and do. And so that's when I started thinking that, all of my study of schools as organizations and the function of the organization really fits in with this idea of leadership. And I'm going to use stories from schools to illustrate how my understanding of leadership has evolved over the last several decades. And even though I'm talking about K-12 schools, all of you who are planning to be student leaders here at Sonoma State, this will be helpful to you, I hope, because like K-12 schools, Sonoma State is a very large educational institution. And in terms of structure and organization, colleges are not really very different from K-12 schools. They're more complex, but the complexities are really analogous to one another. And for those of you who aren't planning to be leaders, I expect you'll still be able to connect what I say to any relevant setting. Okay, so let's start with my childhood concept of leadership in schools. It was, as I said, pretty simple. The idea was that the teacher was the leader and the students were not. The students were the followers. And so let me tell you a story about when I was in first grade. So it was a little while ago, and that was really maybe when my first ideas about leadership started to be challenged. So as I said, I was in first grade. I was in Mrs. Royce's class. And just so that you know, the way this school operated, every recess, your class was assigned a particular part of the playground. You might have handball or kickball or tetherball. And on this fateful day, we were assigned to caroms. Do you know what caroms are? Yeah, well, it's just as well that you don't. Caroms are like, imagine a pool table, but 2 feet by 2 feet wide, made of wood, and it has little pockets in the corner, and you have little cue sticks about this long, and the caroms look a little bit like checkers, and you hit them. Ah, it rings the bell, good, okay. So, imagine, so I'm waiting in line, there are 30 kids in the class, and we're all around 2 or 3 caroms boards. Now picture this 6-year-old boy who has been sitting in a desk for the last 2 hours, and now he's standing in line. And I can't explain to you exactly what happened or what I was thinking about, but one minute I was standing in line, and the next minute I was gone. I was just running across the playground. I went out of the invisible barrier that we were supposed to stay in, and I ran through, got hit by a tetherball as I ran through that, and interfered with a handball game, and eventually came to a rest at a kickball game. And actually, right before I fell down, I turned around and I noticed there were two guys from our caroms game behind me. And they were brandishing these cues like samurai swords. And I got stopped because the ball was being pitched in the kickball game. It was a 6th grade game, and I ran into the ball and I fell down. And immediately there were 3 6th grade boys on top of me, yelling at me and asking me yelling at me and saying, "What are you doing? What are you doing here?" But then they said, "Oh, make way for the yard duty." So the yard duty shows up. Now the yard duty was another 6th grader, and he had a sash across his chest, and he had some authority, and he grabbed me by my shoulder, and grabbed the other 2 guys, and said, "Who's your teacher?" I said, "Mrs. Royce." He said, "Oh boy, you guys are in trouble." And he set us down on the bench. And then Mrs. Royce showed up. Now, Mrs. Royce was probably about 120 years old. She was about 8'4". not really, but a picture of a 6-year-old. You know, she was huge, and she was really scared. And she didn't even, she was a good yeller, but at that moment she didn't need to yell. She just said, stay there. When the bell rings, go to the front of the classroom. Which we did. See, this is cheaper than therapy. I can just tell you about all the traumas in my childhood. So we get in front of the classroom. We had to stand in front while she berated us. Now, I actually don't remember anything about what she said or what it looked like because I was staring at my feet the whole time. But I do remember one part of it, the very end, and that I actually did look up at that moment, and that's when she said, all right, do you want me to just go into the cupboard and rip up your portfolio? The portfolio contained all the year's work. The following week it was going to be displayed at open house. And it was all my stuff, and you know, if I had been able to articulate it, I think I was thinking, what does this have to do with running on the playground? But of course, at the time, it was just, huh? Well, so I looked up at that point and I said, well, no, no, no. And the other boys were saying the same thing. No, don't tear up my portfolio. So she said, all right, are you ever going to run on the playground again? No, no, never. All right, get back to your seats. End of story. I could tell more about that, but that's enough for now. So let me ask you a question. In this little vignette, can you name any leaders? Yes.
You.
Me, I was a leader. I guess there were 2 kids behind me, so I must have been the leader. I never thought about it, I just ran. But apparently, there was some leadership involved, even though it wasn't intentional. Good, any other leaders you can think of? Yes? The yard duty, that's a really interesting, yeah, because he's in the position to enforce. And yet, and he is a leader, and yet he really is just enforcing. I mean, is he a leader or is he just an enforcer, somebody who just carries out what the institution requires? See, it starts getting more complicated. Any other leaders you can think of? Yes? My teacher. She certainly was a leader. Unless you would want to, again, say, well, she's really just enforcing school rules. That was the way children were expected to behave. Okay, so, you know, let's go back to this little thing right here. And, you know, as mature adults, we can see that this is not entirely accurate. There's a lot more going on here. But as a child, I had no clue about you know, that I or any other student was actually being a leader. I just really thought of my teacher. As far as I was concerned, it all came this way still. But I did learn one important truth about leadership, and that is that you don't have to be charismatic. Believe me, Mrs. Royce was a lot of things, but charismatic she wasn't. I certainly wasn't charismatic, and neither was the yard duty, and yet those were the 3 leaders that you named. Okay. So let's fast forward about 15 years when I became a new teacher, age 22, fresh out of college. I was a 4th grade teacher, and you know, as a new teacher, my views of leadership hadn't changed very much. I knew there was this sort of nebulous cloud of people who were called administrators, and I knew they had something to do with something, but I actually rarely, I didn't even know that. I probably barely spoke to the principal ever in that school, and because, as you see, I'll tell you about Mrs. Heidelberg, who really ran things. But can you imagine the pressure? This is kind of an aside. Imagine the pressure it puts on a new teacher who thinks that he or she has to be the source of all leadership. A lot of pressure right there. But fortunately, I wasn't too worried because this was a private school. The kids were exceedingly well behaved. I was handed textbooks for it's 4th grade for each of the subjects, and I just had the students open the books and read the instructions and answer the questions, and everything seemed to go very swimmingly until back to school night, which was maybe 2 or 3 weeks into the semester. You all know about back to school night. That's the one where the teacher kind of gives a speech about each one of the subjects they teach. So I had everything worked out. All the parents came in. This is a fairly ritzy private school. The parents were all better dressed than me. And So they all sat down at their desks and I started talking, and I described the math curriculum and what we were doing, and I described the social studies and science, and finally I got to English. That's like, I was an English major in college. It was where I felt the most confident. And as soon as I started talking about English and reading, a hand went up from the back of the room. It was a woman who said, excuse me, Mr. Kornfeld. You know, Mr. Kornfeld to a 22-year-old. I turned around to see how my dad had gotten into the room. I certainly didn't think of myself as Mr. And Mr. Kornfeld, could you tell us how many sight words a fourth grader ought to have, ought to know? Sight words? That was a term I had never heard in my life. You have to understand that I had gone to an Ivy League school which prepared me for thinking very well, but I knew nothing about teaching, and I didn't know that term. And so, imagine I'm standing up there, and just the seconds seem like hours, and finally I stammered out something like, oh, well, I don't think it's right to try to quantify achievement in children. You know, each child is an individual, and I didn't fool one person in that room. They knew that I didn't know what I was talking about. Then I started, okay, pause, went back to my speech, another hand goes up. Mr. Kornfeld, could you tell us why you're telling lies to our children? Yeah, that, lies, oh, I don't know, what do you mean lies? What? She says, well, my daughter said that if you want to lose weight, you just have to be at the top of a mountain. I had no idea what she was talking about. I stammered some sort of response saying, I really did not knowingly lie to any of your children. That was the beginning of what I realized afterwards was a hazing. I had one question after another that I couldn't answer until, don't worry, I got over it. Until, thank goodness, after 20 minutes of this, Agatha Heidelberg, the teacher from next door, came in and said, oh, parents, I'm so sorry to interrupt, but there are milk and cookies downstairs. She moved them out for me. By the way, the next day I did talk to the child and find out about that lie and see what had happened. She says it was, the little girl said it was when we read that story, you know, about when you go up into the mountains. You said, you go up to the mountains and you get thinner. And I said, no, I said when you go up in the mountains, the air gets thinner. That was too late. That was the day after. So anyway, it was not a pleasant drive home. I started thinking of alternative ways of being employed. But the next day I arrived at school, and I should actually show you. As I was riding home from school, I began to realize that leadership is not just coming from me, and that in fact it doesn't just go in one direction, it tends to go in the other direction. I certainly felt diminished, shall I say, by those parents. So the next day when I got to school, on my desk there was a candy bar, and on it there was a note, and it said, the first 100 years are the hardest. And it was signed Agatha Heidelberg. And so I went into her classroom, and this is not necessarily related to leadership, but maybe to politics. She said, she seemed to know everything that had happened in that classroom the night before, and she said, by the way, Mrs. Smith, you know, who asked me the question about sight words, you should know that she applied for the job that you got. Oh. So she said, just don't worry, if there's a little bit of sour grapes, it's okay. The parents will warm up to you, you'll be fine. And I was. But also, you know, Mrs. Heidelberg was also a good, she helped me understand leadership as well. She was really nice to me at that moment, but she could be really, talk about scary. You know, I told you Mrs. Royce was 8 feet 2. Mrs. Heidelberg came up to about my navel. She was tiny. She was ancient. She was in her 60s. But she seemed really ancient, and she was the scariest teacher on the planet. Made Mrs. Royce look like a milk toast. And she would give me advice. She'd say, this is what you ought to do, John. Put your desk in the back of the room and keep the kids in rows, and from the back they don't know you're looking at them. And if they just move one way or the other, you just nail them to the floor. Yeah. When she said to me, you have to, when we were on the playground with kids, you've got to speak from the diaphragm. You know, this little woman could shout so loud. And she was scary to me. One time, this was the first time I recognized that she could be both sweet and also otherwise with me. I was struggling as a teacher. As I told you, I hadn't really learned anything about how to teach. And my students in math, I could tell they weren't learning anything. They were turning in work that was just terrible. And I had this brilliant idea all by myself. I know all the teachers in the room are going to laugh. It was, why not put the students in groups and have them help one another? I can't get to them fast enough. Sometimes they can understand each other better than they understand me. So I had them scooch their desks into groups of 4, and I got them working. And I could tell things were really happening. Students were understanding it. And so I'm kind of bent over at one of the tables helping the kids when suddenly I hear a noise at the door. And it's Mrs. Heidelberg, and she uses her from diaphragm voice, and she says, "What's going on here? What do you think this is, a poker game? Get back to your seats. Stop talking." At that moment, I stood up, and she says, "Oh, Mr. Kornfeld, I didn't realize that you were in the classroom. I'm so sorry." And she left. I got the message, and the message was, don't mess with the Heidelberg, right? Don't have your kids do anything other than having them in rows and doing their work silently. So I was pretty despondent about that. But a few days later, another teacher. Now, I don't know how all these teachers knew what was going on in my classroom. They did. This was Sarah Gordon. She was maybe 5 years into her teaching career, much more progressive than Agatha Heidelberg. And Sarah said to me, "You know, I hear you're having a little bit of trouble. I hear you're trying to do some group work." She said, "Let me give you some advice. Just fly under the radar." She said, "Close the door to your classroom, put the students in groups and tell them to lift their desks when they move them and to use their 6-inch voices. Mrs. Heidelberg will never know what's going on. Under the radar." And that was actually fabulous advice. The two of them together kind of gave me a sense that, oh, okay, leadership comes from another place as well, both positive and negative. It comes from other teachers. Well, of course, there isn't time to tell students stories, but it also obviously comes from the students. Sometimes it was misbehavior, students dropping their textbooks all at the same time, or just refusing to do what I asked, or saying they'll do what I asked but not doing what I asked, or just fooling around, doing things that kids do. There's actually a lot of research on misbehavior and how that's children's attempt to be creative. Nonetheless, I began to see that it's not just me exercising leadership on the students, it's also students exercising leadership at me. So from all of that, you can see a second truth that I learned about leadership, this one in Kent Place School, and that is that it happens at all levels. It's not just from the, quote, leader, the person who is supposed to be, is kind of the on-paper leader. It happens everywhere. So I'm going to stop for a second because some of you might be thinking this. You might be thinking, you say, wait a minute. This wasn't supposed to be a lecture on leadership, but we seem to be straying away from leadership. I keep calling it leadership, but maybe what I'm really talking about is power, right? Clearly, what I'm talking about over here, if you look back, is who holds the power over who, right? And as I began to understand leadership a little bit more as a teacher, I began to see that leadership and that leadership and power are really not that dissimilar. And interestingly, I made up this definition of leadership, and shortly after that I saw a lecture by Elaine Leader. Have any of you taken her Soc 201 class? Have you seen the definition that she provides for power? The ability to get people to do things they wouldn't ordinarily do. It's very similar to leadership. And so you need to start thinking about the relationship between leadership and power. Power is mentioned several times in the chapter that we're referring to here. The idea that you need to be empowered to be a leader. But the question is, where does that power come from? I think power can be divided into two distinct types. On the one hand, you've got personal power. Personal power is what you bring to the table. It's what you feel about yourself. It's about your knowledge and your experience and your abilities. And self-assurance is a big part of personal power that you have. And it can't get taken away from you. It doesn't matter if you're a student or a teacher or a parent, you just have that power. Agatha Heidelberg had the power, right? Positional power, that's external to you. It includes the job title and the privileges and authority that come with it. When I became an associate vice president here, I had certain access that I didn't have when I wasn't. But by itself, that access doesn't mean anything unless you're able to also exert personal power. For one thing, it can get taken away. When I retire, that access is going to go away. I'm not going to be able to do some of the things that I do because they come with the job, they come with the title. So let's consider power dynamics at Kent Place School. I was at the same position level as Agatha Heidelberg, and yet she wielded so much more personal power. In fact, one reason why I didn't know any of the administrators is she ran things. Every administrator in that school was scared of her. And she wielded that power, not scared of her, they were overwhelmed by her. And she wielded that power to maintain her leadership. Sarah, on the other hand, Sarah Gordon, the teacher who helped me, she also had a great deal of personal power. So she wielded it to be helpful. And she wielded it in order to empower me. So you can use your power to empower people, or you can use your power to disempower them. So power isn't necessarily top-down. You have to have these intersecting realms of power that depend a lot on the personalities of the players. That's why it's so important that each of you find the power in yourself as you take on leadership roles. Okay, so I want you to consider position and personal power and their connection to leadership when I tell you this last story from my teaching. First of all, you should know that I was at Kent Place School for about 5 years, then I was somewhere else for 3 years. So I had about 8 or 9 years of teaching under my belt when I came to Monorail School. Now, after all those years of teaching, my conception of leadership was really a lot more mature than it had been at the beginning. I even began to realize that administrators hold key roles, that can hold key roles as well. They're not just these nebulous people, but they can actually provide leadership that can either be supportive or not, that really have a lot to do with the way the school is run and the way the school feels. And case in point, I'll tell a little bit about my experience at Monorail. So, I got hired in late August, or mid-August, right before the semester began. And so I didn't really know any of the teachers, I didn't know any of the students, and I just got my room together and then showed up on the first day of school, a beautiful fall day, warm fall morning. And I show up on the playground, I have a portable in my room, it's right off the playground. And the kids are all there, kids are all out there, 150 kids, a small K-8 elementary school, 200 kids, and they're all milling around. And the teachers are all milling around too, everybody's just kind of hanging out. And then Mr. Jones comes, he's the principal. He's got a giant sack, like Santa Claus. He's also about 6 feet, probably. And it turns out it's full of sports equipment. And the kids all gather around him, and he distributes all the sports equipment. And within 3 minutes, 95% of the kids are all engaged in different team sports. Football, basketball, those were the two main things in fall. I'm trying to think of what else. There was maybe a soccer game going on. It was quite amazing, and all the teachers are kind of sitting there watching. And I said, well, so when does school start? They said, one of them said, about 9. I said, about 9? What do you mean, like, exactly? He said, no, about 9. I said, well, what time does the bell ring? He said, oh, we don't have bells here. Okay. So I just kind of hung out, and by about, 9:15, Mr. Jones calls the kids. They all run in, they give them the balls, they all disperse, they all come into the classroom, and school begins. Mr. Jones was very much a sort of centerpiece of this place. The kids, every recess was like this, every lunch recess before school, they were all like this. He'd be out with the balls, the kids would come out, they'd all play all of these team sports, and he was really into sports. That was his main thing. He taught PE to the 7th and 8th graders, he coached the 8th grade boys and 7th grade boys in football and basketball. And clearly that was his passion. He didn't really pay much attention to what was going on academically. So somebody said to me, one of the students actually said, one of my 8th graders said to me during that first week, hey, will you come out to our football game? And I thought, great, okay, I'll go. Clearly it's important at this school. So I went. We had a very good team that year, and we played the first game. It was against Gurnville, and we lost the football game. And I noticed a few things, actually, around execution that I felt they could do better, the boys. So I kind of thought to myself, okay, under the radar, okay, I don't want to cause any waves, but I think I can really help these kids. So I had the 8th graders before lunch, and I said, boys, stick around for a few minutes. I want to show you a couple of things. Which they did, and I showed them, made the suggestions, mostly around special teams, kickoff and punts and kickoff returns. And so I went to the next game, and then the next day they said, thanks a lot. And the next day they came in, and I gave them a few other little pointers, just a few little things. And when they played their game that following week, they won. And at the end of the game, I went over to some of the boys and told them congratulations. And one of them said, well, thanks to you, really, thanks a lot. And so I felt really good. I felt very proud about what I had accomplished for these boys. So the football season ends after a couple of months. And 3 or 4 months later, one of my students comes in, and he's wearing brand new sneakers. And now you have to understand, this is a very impoverished school. Most kids, and certainly that kid, wouldn't have had the money for a new pair of sneakers. And they were like, really, whatever model was tops in the 80s. I said, where'd you get them? He said, Mr. Jones giving out sneakers. And he was giving out sneakers. It turns out Mr. Jones had a contact somewhere in the industry, and the guy gave him some models that were this model that was just being discontinued, and he gave him hundreds of pairs, enough for every kid in the school. And over the next 2 weeks maybe, every kid who wanted a pair of shoes got one. Well, then I noticed one day, Jane, where's Jane? Are you in here somewhere? Yeah, Jane McDonough, who's one of the, Jane actually taught at that school. And I noticed Jane one day wearing a pair of sneakers, new sneakers. Turns out the teachers were getting new sneakers. And over the next several days, every teacher had a new pair of sneakers, except me. I went to the teacher's room, and I looked, and even old Mrs. Z, she was like 80 years old, chain smoked, right? She had a pair of sneakers. She was never going to run another yard, but she had a pair of sneakers. And so I said to the I walked in, I kind of announced to the group at large, gosh, I wonder when Mr. Jones is going to give me my pair of sneakers. So Jane comes up to me, puts her arm around me and says, John, you will never get a pair of sneakers. And everybody laughed. It's like they all knew. And you're really going to feel sorry for me at the end of this lecture, aren't you? No, it was a very, very important lesson, because it turns out there was no such thing as under the radar. Mr. Jones, think about this, sports, team sports. To Mr. Jones, everything was about a team. We are a team here. We all help one another. We all support one another. And what did I do? He was the coach. I told his kids things to do. without talking to him about it, without saying, hey, you know, I noticed some stuff, can I help? Would you like my help, or would you like to, could I do something? No, but he knew everything that was going on at that school that he cared about, and I had no idea. And his way, he wasn't going to tell me, John, you're not being a team player. The way he did it was, John, you're never going to get a pair of sneakers, and I didn't. But it was a very important lesson because I began to understand that the culture in the school has a lot to do with how you exercise leadership. Now, nowhere was that idea of teamwork more evident than it was actually at back to school night. Yes, another back to school night. My first back to school night there. I didn't realize teamwork was the key until I thought about it later. So, that first back to school night, you have to realize I was emotionally scarred, right? I was terrified about back to school nights, right? But I figured, okay, I'll just plow ahead. I had my speech ready, all of the different subjects that the students were learning, and I was experienced by then. I had several years under my belt. So I knew much more about teaching. I did know what sight words were by then, although nobody was talking about them anymore. So the parents all filed in. It's a very different socioeconomic group than in that first school. As I mentioned, a lot of people who are in need of free lunch, a lot of poverty in that school. And but they all show up, and even before I can get my first word out, a hand goes up. It's like, oh my God, deja vu, what's going to happen? I answer the person, and she says, how can I get my son to do more homework? I send him to his room to do his homework, and he just doesn't do it. And I'm thinking to myself, trick question? Is this another hazing? But before I can even respond, a parent at the other side of the room says, hey, does he have a TV in his room? The other parent says, yeah. She says, get rid of the TV. He might get some work done. Okay. Another hand goes up. No, it wasn't even a hand. They just started talking. Another person said, well, I don't have a TV in my son's, we don't even have a TV, but my kid still doesn't do his work. I say to him, you come home, you get your work done, and afterward you're done with your work, then you can have your snack. And I think that'll be a reason enough to get him to do his work, but he just won't. And another parent said, you gotta feed him first, right? And you know, I'm standing here thinking, whoa, this isn't about me at all. These people are really wanting to know about how to support their students. One mother raised her hand or spoke out and said, I just want my son, I don't care about homework, I just want my son to really find friends that can be soulmates, she said. Yeah, I mean, I know that sounds hokey, but it's not. She was really concerned about her son socially. And so what I began to recognize is, this is a conversation. Maybe I'll join in. I know something too. So I would also give my responses, but it wasn't as though I was the center of it. It was that this was a community in which people were going to problem solve about their children. And there was, well, I'll tell you one more question that I got asked because it really stopped me cold. This was a guy named Tall Ted. A lot of people there had like an adjective or a noun and then their name, like Biker Paul, Tall Ted. And Tall Ted raised his hand and he said, sort of was still for a moment and said, are your students learning more than you are teaching them? Now, by this time, I wasn't worried that I was being hazed, so I just kind of thought about it. First, I thought, what are you talking about? I teach, they learn, right? But then I thought, how sad that would be if the only thing they learned was what I knew and what I taught them. See, right now, I'm talking to you, and I'm telling you specific things, but you're not going to remember these stories. What I'm hoping is you'll apply what you're hearing from these stories to things you already know and have experienced yourself, and you'll come up with ideas about leadership that I never would have thought of. See, you, I hope, will learn more than I'm teaching you now. And that's what started going through my mind, all in a split second. And I had this was this epiphany, which We actually teach now in the School of Education, but back then, this was new to me. My goodness, people can actually learn more than I'm teaching them. And at that moment I said, yeah, I hope so. And I hope that, and I said pretty much what I just said to you now, to this parent, that it was all new to me. So this back to school night wasn't just me talking at them, it was actually me learning and becoming a better teacher as a result. Think about that. This was a form of collaborative leadership. So, you know, everything, then I began to understand more and more that everything goes in every which direction, right? Until pretty soon, we can't really tell where the leaders are, right? Okay, so what are the truths about leadership that I learned at Monterey School? Well, one of them, of course, is there's not one identifiable right way to lead an organization or group. Clearly, that's really important, because think about leadership at Kent Place School versus leadership at Monterey School. At Kent Place School, in order to survive and in order to be empowered and provide the leadership I wanted to do with my students, I had to stay under the radar. That was the only way to do it. Whereas at Monterey, it was the opposite. Staying under the radar was destructive to my status as a teacher and was destructive to the organization as a whole. I was modeling bad leadership by undermining the most popular leader at the school, which actually takes me to the other one, the idea of distinguishing between leadership and management. That would be a whole other hour-long lecture, but think about it. Mr. Jones, he actually was a charismatic leader. How many years ago was that? 30 some odd years ago? His former students still talk about him and the way they felt about him in his role as this statesman at the school, or sportsman. But he was a terrible manager. Things the school district was required to do, he didn't really pay attention to. It's boring. The management part is really uninteresting because it involves continually sort of keeping things running. I find that I have to struggle in my current position. As many of you may know, I'm involved with registration and GE, and there's how many students we can get into how many classes. And I could spend all my time just kind of worrying about things that are very important, like that you get your units and that you're able to progress through your degree. But I need to be doing more. I need to also be thinking about how your education can be more exciting, more meaningful to you. Those big questions require putting the management to the side. So even though we didn't touch on it a lot, it's really important. So I'm going to show you these two these two sort of differences. It's between the 6-year-old me and the 60-plus-year-old me. When you look at this slide comparing the two, you can see that my evolving vision of leadership mirrors the increasingly complex understanding that you read about in your book. Maybe a true leader, really, is somebody who can harness all that energy from all these different constituencies, who can make sense of all that chaos there, and help all of the people in the school to do what they need to do to continually improve the world for their students. Okay, I want to go back to sort of a generic organizational structure. But if you consider it, this generic organizational structure is really the same at Kent Place as it is at Monterey. But they are totally different places. And again, just to reiterate, being a leader in one place required very different strategies and interactions than at the other. You're going to experience this as you have discussions with one another about your different leadership positions. You might both be peer mentors, but you might be a peer mentor and somebody else might be, but what they're being expected to do and what it takes to be successful in that class will be completely different than it would be to be successful in another class. A lot of it depends on the culture that has been established in that particular class. So what do you do if you're new to an organization, whether it's school or someplace else? First, do nothing, and possibly do nothing for a while. Watch and ask questions, take no sides, learn how things work. As one administrator I admire here said, you need to spend some time kicking the tires. Okay, I'm going to return to what I said at the beginning of the lecture, which is I really don't understand exactly what leadership is. But I think I understand it better and better every day. Now, there are two truths about leadership that I haven't touched on yet, and that is, let me talk about them really quickly. So think about the idea that leaders are made and not born. Consider my own trajectory, what I just described to you over the years. I always saw myself as responsible to just get the job done. Then people started asking me to do more. My principal signed me up to do a teacher workshop. I never thought about myself teaching teachers. She said to me, hey, you're an expert in teaching history, you should help other people. Right? She kind of pushed me to the next level. This was something I'd never thought about before. Here at Sonoma State, my dean asked me to teach an FYE, and my colleagues asked me to coordinate FYE. Gradually, I found myself taking on more and more responsibility. I wasn't a born leader, but I grew into the role. And the scary part is, the older you get, the more the people who were your mentors, the more they disappear. And then you look around and you say, hey, I'm it. I have no choice but to lead. Now, not to compare myself to somebody much greater than me, but isn't that exactly what happens to Harry Potter? Go back and read the speech that Dumbledore gives to him in the King's Cross Station. And he says, it's a curious thing, but perhaps those who are best suited to power are those who have never sought it. So if you're one of those people, take part. Finally, leadership is teachable. Well, that's what this course really is all about. Clearly, you can't learn to be a leader simply by studying it. But by studying and applying it to real-life situations, all of us in here are convinced that it's possible. But as I've tried to show you today, it's a lifelong journey. You'll have to let us all know at the end of the semester and at the end of your leadership experience if we were right. So I wish you all luck in this course. I wish you luck in your leadership, and I hope I was